Hello and welcome back. Today, as we continue to look at our theme of the people and the land, I want to focus on industry and manufacturing in Tennessee. So, as far as early industry is concerned, most pioneer Tennesseans, as you know, were farmers, and they produced many of their own goods through household manufacture. There weren't any factories at this point in time, so they made what they used on the farm. Early settlers made yarn and cloth at their spinning wheels and their looms. They made their own farm implements, tools, furniture. They ground wheat and corn to make flour and meal that they used in cooking. They also processed animal hides into their clothes. They made saddles, they made shoes, and other leather goods. And they produced lumber at the small sawmills in and around their communities. So early industrial activity happened in towns. For instance, Knoxville produced flour, cotton, and leather goods. Cotton factories were operating in Davidson County in the early 1800s. Some claim that the South's first cotton mill was established near Nashville in the early 1790s. The most important of the early industries utilized uh, local raw materials, mostly in the way of iron ore, coal, and timber. So those are the things I want to talk about for just a few minutes. So I want to talk about the extractive industry. This is extracting raw materials and transforming them into a useful product. So in terms of mining, of course, that's an extractive industry. You're taking the minerals out of the ground and you're using them to produce something else. Historically, Tennessee's most important mining products have been iron, bituminous coal, copper, lead, zinc, and phosphate. Iron ore was the most significant during the early settlement years. Interest in iron ore of the western highland rim dates back to about the 1790s and even earlier in some of the eastern mountains. Early miners engaged in surface mining. They didn't have the equipment necessary to get at the minerals locked within the Earth's core. So they stripped the ore by hand, or they used horses or mules to pull the ore out of the ground. Iron ore was significant in the production of iron. East Tennessee may have had some iron and lead production as early as the Revolutionary War era. Iron production in Middle Tennessee began in the 1790s, and by the mid 1850s, there's over 50 iron productions or operations in Middle Tennessee. Early iron operations were located on rivers and streams because they needed the water power to use what they called the trip hammers in the small forges or the bloomeries, and we'll learn more about that here in a few minutes. But cast iron, wrought iron, and rolled iron was produced from the water-powered bellows in these blast furnaces and from crude rolling mills. And you see one of the blast furnaces there at Bear Spring furnace. This is near Fort Donelson in Middle Tennessee. So by 1860, Tennessee ranked third nationally in bloomery output. And these early iron making operations took place on plantations and was by and large produced by slave labor. As time goes on, though, iron mining becomes less and less important in Tennessee as the number of producing mines and the volume of ore production drop by half from 1909 to 1919. And by the later years, Tennessee contributed only half of a percent of national iron ore production. So this is Cumberland Furnace that you see here on the slide. It established some of the earliest iron manufacturing. General James Robertson, like other pioneers, soon discovered that the Western Highland Rim contained abundant iron ore deposits. And so in 1793, Robertson purchased 640 acres on this tract of land. He built this furnace for his ironworks. You can see how the forge was built closer to the mouth of the creek, and the furnace went into blast, as they say, in 1796. So 8 years later, Montgomery Bell, who was a native of Chester County, Pennsylvania, came to Tennessee, and he bought the furnace from Robertson for $16,000. This was a huge amount of money for the early 19th century. Bell improved the efficiency of the furnace, and he made his iron plantation more self-sufficient. And so between 1810 and 1820, Bell constructed a second furnace. And by 1812, he had a contract to furnish the national government with cannon shot, gunpowder, and whiskey on the side there. So not only is he making iron, but he's making whiskey as well. So he has a nice little business going here. During the War of 1812, Bell became the chief supplier of ammunition for both the Navy and for General Andrew Jackson's army. Now, the furnace changes hands a few times over the years. During the Great Depression, the furnace operated intermittently until about 1938, and then it went bankrupt. In July 1940, the courts transferred the property to the Cumberland Iron Company. And then during the Second World War, the furnace was completely dismantled for the wartime scrap metal drives. Finally, though, in 1988, the village of Cumberland Furnace, with over 30 more buildings and sites associated with the iron industry, was listed as a historic district on the National Register of Historic Places. So here is a short video explaining the process of making iron from a furnace.
I'm Shel Browder. I'm one of the journeyman blacksmiths from Colonial Williamsburg. Steve Mankowski and I are up here today to run a bloomery furnace to make iron in the way that it's been made for over 4,000 years, it appears. Iron basically exists in nature as a rusty rock, but it exists as a form of iron oxide, and you have to get rid of the oxygen and some of the mechanical inclusions as well. We're using some ore now that we collected in Virginia. It's already been roasted and crushed, and it'll go into a small operation called a bloomery, or a bloomery furnace. It's a direct reduction process that'll give us a bloom of wrought iron at the end of the run, probably 5 or 6 hours or so. And from there it can be forged into bars to make axes and nails and other things. We'll start the morning by preheating the furnace with charcoal. Once that's pretty well preheated, about an hour or so, then we'll begin to add finer charcoal and iron ore at a ratio of a pound each. Of course, the volumes are quite different, but it should be about 1 pound of iron ore to 1 pound of charcoal. As it travels down through the burning charcoal, it begins to be reduced so that you get a bloom of iron, as it's called, perhaps because it blooms and grows from a small seed-size piece of iron ore into a chunk that can be hammered. You have to run it all day. You keep the charcoal and the iron ore itself layered so that it's right up to the top of the furnace. The furnace isn't actually a chimney, it's a stack. So the whole thing is involved in the reduction of iron ore. This is not a process that involves any instrumentation at all. You have to learn how to hear the sound of the fire and the air blast, to observe the slag that forms and runs out of the bottom of the bloomery. And there are long periods of time when you're just moving back and forth and nothing seems to be happening. And then at the end of the day, it'll suddenly be very intense as you pull out a bloom that could be anywhere from, in this, probably 14 to 20 pounds or so. And very quickly cut it into parts that you can forge with hand hammers into usable bars. That's a brief synopsis of a process that actually takes many hours, both in the preparation and in the operation and finishing.
So that's helpful in helping you see how iron is forged from the iron ore. So iron's close companion in the early industry was coal. Tennesseans began to mine coal in small quantities during the 1840s. Blacksmiths who used the coal in their shops undertook much of this mining activity. And unlike iron, coal production in the state has remained significant ever since. Tennessee's coal is bituminous or soft. It's the soft variety, and it's found in extensive deposits along the northeast, southwest belt, and a little east of the center of the state. But coal mining became a significant Tennessee industry only after the end of the Civil War. It's in the 1870s that northern investors and businessmen bought up huge acreage in the mineral-rich areas of Appalachia, and by the early 20th century, many of these capitalists, investors, businessmen controlled most of the best coal districts. During the 1880s, there was a great increase in coal production, and employment rose to more than 4,000 workers in Tennessee. These were workers laboring above the ground, and there were more, about 3,400 men working below the ground during the 1880s. By the turn of the 20th century, bituminous coal was the state's leading mining industry. And by the 1910s, coal mining constituted more than half of the mining enterprise in the state. So over 60% of the wage earners were employed in mining in Tennessee, and mining contributed over 60% of the value of the mining production. So coal was very, very important to the state of Tennessee. As late as the 1940s, underground mines provided nearly all of the coal produced in Tennessee. The state's coal fields were not considered suitable for strip or what they call strip mining or auger mining because they were located under mountain peaks and contained relatively thin seams of coal. But once more sophisticated machinery was developed, strip mining and auger mining became prevalent in the state. And by 1975, about 60% of the state's coal was strip mined. And that did terrible damage to the environment. And we'll talk more about that in another segment. By the early 1990s, the number of coal mining establishments in Tennessee began to fall. They'd fallen more than about 2/3. So coal goes through a recessive time, and the value of shipments begins to fall off as well. The major markets for Tennessee coal in recent decades have been utilities in Tennessee and in neighboring states. There's a relatively small amount of coal that's been exported primarily to Japan. Lead and zinc production also has origins in Tennessee's early history. The earliest deposits were mined near Bumpus Cove in Washington and Unicoi counties. They were worked as early as the Revolutionary War era. There are also deposits in the Powell River District in Claiborne and Union counties that were mined in the 19th century to make ammunition. The primary modern uses of lead are mostly for storage batteries, gasoline additives, paint pigments, ammunition, and various alloys. Other mining operations have been located in the White Pine District of Jefferson County. Some lead mines were in operation before the Civil War in Davidson County and in Williamson County later on during the First World War. In recent years, no mines have been worked exclusively for lead, but there is a small amount of the mineral that was recovered primarily as a byproduct of the copper mining in Polk County. The first zinc mining in Tennessee occurred at Mossy Creek in Jefferson City in 1854. These early mines were mostly open pit operations, recovering the ore near the surface, and then once the surface deposits were depleted, the industry was dominated by large underground operations like those that sprung up in Knox, Jefferson, Hawkins, Hancock, and Granger counties. Tennessee zinc ore is shipped to other states for smelting, and then the concentrates are used to manufacture die castings, paint pigments. The metal is also used in galvanizing and brass manufacture for fermenting things like pennies and metal sheets for battery cases. Zinc metal is also used in the production of some pharmaceuticals. In terms of copper, Tennessee was the only major southern producer of copper, which is considered second only to iron as an important industrial metal. Copper mining in Tennessee began in the middle of the 19th century in what's known as the Ducktown Copper Hill District, commonly known as Copper Basin, and it's all contained in Polk County. The mineral was first discovered in the area during the 1840s, and then you had the Hiwassee mine, the copper mine that opened up in 1850, and it became the first deep underground mine in Tennessee. And by 1864, there are going to be 4 other mines that will open up and in this region and mine copper. The 1870 U.S. Census ranked Tennessee third nationally in the value of copper production. The first smelter was established at the Eureka mine in 1885, and it was soon followed by several others. By 1909, copper was the second leading mineral industry in Tennessee, and copper mining continued in this area until the Tennessee Chemical Company closed its mines in 1987, and this was after 137 years of being open for production. Phosphate, Tennessee was once a national leader in phosphate mining, but in modern times it's fallen down to 5th in national production. Production of phosphate came primarily from Middle Tennessee counties of Williamson, Hickman, Maury, Giles, but there's been some phosphate mining in Davidson and Sumner counties as well. Through the 1930s, phosphate rock was primarily used to produce fertilizers. In recent years, most of the phosphate mined in Tennessee has been smelted in electric furnaces for the production of phosphorus. Phosphorus is used in water softening and cleansing products, in soaps, detergents, insecticides, military products some military products contain phosphorus, and it's also the element used in oil refining. Likewise, marble is very important in Tennessee. It has a long and interesting history. The first activities date back to the late 1840s when stone was produced for use in construction of the Washington Monument. And during the next decade, production began in the Knoxville area, with some of the stone being used in the construction of the state capitol building. And the reputation for Tennessee marble began to spread, and it became famous for not only its high quality, but its variety of its coloration. It was widely used across the United States and in other countries, especially in the interiors of public buildings. Among some of the famous structures that feature extensive use of Tennessee marble are the J.P. Morgan Library in New York City, the Capitol Building, the National Gallery of Art that I have pictured here, the Jefferson and the Lincoln Memorials, the National Cathedral, and most recently, the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center. So if you take a trip to Washington, D.C. in particular, you can tell whoever you're with that, part of Tennessee is in the building there. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial, you can talk about Tennessee marble. So by the 1920s, there were 11 active marble companies in Tennessee. And in the 1960s, Tennessee ranked second in national production of marble. After that time, production and the number of operations began to drop, but there is a recovery due to the fact that there's some major construction projects that take place in the late 1980s, and this included the renovation of New York City's Grand Central Station. So if you go to New York City and you visit Grand Central Station, know that Tennessee marble was used in renovating this building as well. In recent years, though, the marble industry faces quite a bit of tough competition from producers worldwide, particularly in Italy and in Spain. So, although Tennessee's earliest settlers appreciated the vast timber resources they discovered, the greatest timber extraction in the state's history will occur between the 1880s and the 1920s. Rapid deforestation by industrial logging during this time period caused long-term environmental changes and notable revision of state and federal policies. By the early 19th century, the iron industry found that hardwood was very valuable for their blast furnaces because it would burn longer and hotter. And so a typical 8-foot square forge required a layer of charcoal 4 feet thick in order to melt 400 pounds of ore in 2 hours. So not surprisingly, the woods around these forges were typically cut down. So demand for wood to produce charcoal encouraged the state to pass a law in 1809 that permitted iron makers to acquire large tracts of land just for harvesting the wood. Large-scale timber and mining would not become profitable, however, until the railroad moved to Tennessee. Despite repeated petitions, by the 1850s, the state only had about 1,200 miles of railroad track. So this relatively slow entrance into the new transportation age probably protected Tennessee forests longer than the neighboring states of Kentucky and Virginia. As railroads began carving up the state after the Civil War, struggling farmers picked up a little extra income by cutting and selling medium-sized species of trees like locust to the railroad companies to make railroad ties. Beginning in the 1870s, Nashville and Memphis promoters welcomed northeastern lumbermen to Tennessee. And in 1881, Southern Lumberman, which remains the major trade association publication for Southern hardwood companies, began publication in Nashville. Nashville companies got much of their hardwood from small entrepreneurs along the Cumberland River. Enterprising men cut trees during the winter, and then when the spring rains came and swelled the streams that fed into the Cumberland River, they floated out rafts of logs and sold them to the Nashville lumber mills. In 1910, hardwood mills operated as well in Memphis. Furniture makers from all over the nation bought wood in Memphis. Memphis, by this time, billed itself as, quote, the hardwood capital of the world. In East Tennessee, lumbermen also sought out specialty wood, especially cherry and walnut. There were many logging companies that built sawmills all over the state, and the logging companies built towns and they built railroads to help them extract the wood. In 1912, Tennessee lumber workers put in 60-hour weeks, and they were paid about 14 cents on the hour. Wages did not rise even when the demands for the southern hardwood increased. So it was a very hard job that the workers received very little pay for. Here's a picture of a turn-of-the-century logging camp near Tellico Plains. But you see it's a logging camp and it's a sawmill as well. Turn-of-the-century lumbermen took so many trees down so quickly that Gifford Pinchot, who you see pictured here on the left, Pinchot was the head of the U.S. Forestry Service, and he predicted that all of the timber in the United States would be gone in 20 years if something wasn't done to prevent this. So not only were the trees being cut down and the forest being depleted, but it also resulted in a dramatic loss of wildlife because habitats were being destroyed. So these warnings from Pinchot and others helped lead the nation toward the establishment of national forests. In Tennessee, to protect game and to improve tourism, Governor Austin Peay, who you also see on the screen here, he was the first to initiate Tennessee's first game laws, and he established a Department of Forestry in Tennessee. Also, this careless management by timber companies had allowed fire to spread in these clear-cut mountainsides, and erosion, also because of the cutting down of so many trees, erosion is occurring, and this is also damaging the land. So this rapid deforestation and soil loss created high runoff patterns, and so major flooding also followed. So partially in response to the swollen rivers and the denuded land, the federal government in the 1930s initiated major reforms as the Tennessee Valley Authority, and we'll talk more about that later. There are also projects connected with the New Deal, known as the Civilian Conservation Corps, that will be operational in Tennessee. There'll be a designation of the Cherokee National Forest and also creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So we'll talk more about this in the near future, but I appreciate, that's all I want to say about Tennessee industry right now. I appreciate you listening, and I will be talking to you again very soon.